It is a few minutes past 9 at night, deep winter in the southern hemisphere, and in the remote mountains north of a small lakeside town called Tectonic, the ground does something it has not done in living memory. Seismometers buried in rock that has not moved in generations begin to shudder. Within seconds, the shaking radiates outward through solid stone, racing under fjords, under glaciers, under the black winter water of Milford Sound, and out toward a coastline where almost no one is watching the sea. Phones across the South Island buzz at the same instant, screens flashing red, sirens somewhere in a control room already beginning to spin up. Nobody in that room needs to be told what this could mean. They have been waiting for something like this for years, and now, for the first time in a long time, the waiting appears to be over. The first number that flashes across international monitoring systems is 5. 9. Not catastrophic, not the number that ends cities, but large enough, sudden enough, and placed in exactly the wrong spot to make every emergency official within 1,000 kilometers sit up straight. Within minutes, that number will be reassessed and revised upward. But in the opening chaos of the event, it is the 5. 9 that travels first, the 5. 9 that lights up news alerts from Wellington to Sydney to newsrooms on the other side of the planet, the 5. 9 that becomes the number people search for at 3 in the morning when they cannot sleep because the earth just moved beneath them. And the reason this particular tremor matters so much more than its size alone would suggest has nothing to do with how strong it was. It has everything to do with where it happened. Te Anau sits at the edge of Fiordland, a region of New Zealand so remote and so mountainous that entire valleys have no roads, no towns, nothing but forest, ice, and rock stretching to the horizon. It looks, from a satellite, like one of the last truly wild places left on Earth. But beneath that beauty lies one of the most geologically loaded stretches of crust on the planet, a place where 2 of Earth's great tectonic plates are locked in a slow, grinding, centuries-long collision that has been building toward a release for longer than anyone alive has been walking the surface above it. When the ground shakes here, seismologists do not simply log the number and move on. They open old files. They pull up decades of monitoring data. They ask the question that has been sitting quietly in the back of every New Zealand earthquake briefing for years: is this the one? To understand why a single tremor near a town of barely 2,000 people can trigger a tsunami warning, cancel evening plans across an entire coastline, and draw the attention of geological agencies as far away as the United States Geological Survey, you first have to understand what New Zealand actually is, geologically speaking. It is not simply a country that happens to have earthquakes. It is a nation built directly on top of the seam where 2 continental plates meet, a seam that runs the entire length of the country like a scar. In the North Island, the Pacific Plate is being forced downward, sliding underneath the Australian Plate in a process called subduction, generating the volcanoes, the geothermal fields, and the deep tremors that punctuate life across that half of the country. In the South Island, the relationship flips. Here it is the Australian Plate that dives beneath the Pacific Plate, in a mirror image of the process happening further north, and the boundary between them surfaces as one of the most dangerous geological features anywhere on Earth, the Alpine Fault. The Alpine Fault runs almost the entire length of the South Island, a nearly straight scar visible even from space, carving along the western edge of the Southern Alps for hundreds of kilometers. It is the reason those mountains exist at all. Every few hundred years, the fault ruptures in a single violent motion, and the land on either side lurches past itself, sometimes displacing by more than 7 meters in a matter of seconds. Each of those ruptures adds another lift to the mountains, another layer to peaks that did not exist as recently as human history would suggest. The Southern Alps are, quite literally, built out of catastrophe, one earthquake at a time, over millions of years. And this is the part that turns a routine magnitude 5.9 into something closer to a warning shot. Geological records, pulled from soil layers, displaced riverbeds, and radiocarbon-dated debris, show the Alpine Fault has ruptured in a major earthquake roughly every 200 to 400 years for at least the last 8,000 years. The most recent of those major ruptures happened in the year 1717, an event now believed to have registered somewhere around magnitude 8, one of the largest earthquakes New Zealand has ever experienced, in a period of history before anyone was recording it with instruments, only with oral tradition and the wreckage it left behind. That means, as of the moment this new tremor struck, the Alpine Fault has been sitting silent, locked, and accumulating strain for more than 300 years. It has not simply been resting, it has been loading, plate by plate, millimeter by millimeter, storing up energy the way a bow stores tension when it is pulled back and never released. Scientists who have spent their careers studying this fault put a number on the risk that most people outside New Zealand have never heard, and it is not a small number. Current estimates place the probability of the Alpine Fault producing another magnitude 8 or larger earthquake at roughly 75% within the next 50 years, 3 and 4. Not a distant theoretical possibility filed away in an academic paper, but a live probability being tracked in real time by an entire national emergency management structure built specifically around the assumption that this fault will break, and that when it does, it will not ask for permission or give much warning before it happens. This is the landscape into which the new tremor arrived. It struck roughly 40 kilometers north of Teanau, deep in the unpopulated wilderness of northern Fjordland, at a depth of around 50 kilometers, in a zone geologists call the Poiseugur subduction zone. It is important to be precise here because in the frantic first hour after any large earthquake, precision is often the first casualty. The tremor did not occur on the Alpine Fault itself. It occurred on a related but distinct structure, the point where the Australian plate is forced downward beneath the Pacific plate along the Poiseugur Trench, a deep oceanic trench that extends more than 800 kilometers south from the tip of the South Island all the way toward Antarctica. At its northern end, this trench transitions directly into the Alpine Fault, the two systems part of the same enormous plate boundary, different chapters of the same geological story. The distinction matters, and it does not. It matters scientifically, because a rupture on the Poiseugur subduction interface is a mechanically different event from a rupture on the Alpine Fault's strike-slip surface, and the two do not automatically trigger one another in any simple, predictable way. Scientists who examined this event in the hours and days that followed were careful to say exactly that. This earthquake did not occur on the Alpine Fault, and current evidence suggests it is unlikely to have meaningfully changed the stress loading on the fault itself. But the distinction barely registers for anyone standing on a dock in Milford Sound at 9:30 at night, phone buzzing with an emergency alert. Because both structures sit within the same seismically restless neighborhood, both are capable of producing enormous earthquakes, and both remind the people who live along this coastline that they are residents of one of the most tectonically active corners of the planet, whether the specific fault line matters to them in that moment or not. There is a strange kind of arithmetic hidden inside that 75% figure, one that becomes more unsettling the longer you sit with it. It is not a number derived from guesswork or dramatic license. It comes from years of painstaking fieldwork, from geologists cutting trenches across the fault line by hand, from carbon dating charcoal layers buried in the soil, from matching displaced stream beds on one side of the fault to their original path on the other. Each rupture leaves a signature in the ground, a kind of geological fingerprint that scientists have learned to read the way a detective reads a crime scene decades after the fact. 27 times in the last 8,000 years that signature appears. 27 major ruptures, spaced with enough consistency that statisticians can build a genuine probability model around them. Not a horoscope, not a guess, but an actual calculated likelihood drawn from one of the most complete earthquake histories preserved anywhere on the planet. And every single one of those 27 ruptures happened without the benefit of satellites, seismometers, or emergency alert systems. The next one will not have that excuse. What happened next unfolded with the particular practiced urgency of a country that has been preparing for exactly this kind of night for a very long time. At 9:38, New Zealand's National Emergency Management Agency pushed an emergency mobile alert directly to phones across the Fjordland tsunami evacuation zone. The message was blunt, designed to be understood instantly by someone standing in the dark, in the cold, uncertain what to do. It told people a large earthquake had struck near Fjordland, that a tsunami was expected, and that anyone in an evacuation zone needed to leave immediately, heading to high ground or inland, away from beaches, rivers, and the sea. For the small, scattered communities along that coastline, places built around tourism, fishing, and some of the most dramatic scenery on the planet, this was not an abstract instruction. It was a command to move now in the dark on a cold winter night without waiting to see if the warning proved accurate. People did exactly what they had been trained to do. Long before any official alert had even reached some coastal households, residents who felt the shaking directly, who understood in their bodies before any siren told them that this tremor lasted too long and rolled too hard to be ordinary, began evacuating on their own instinct. This self-evacuation reflex is something New Zealand's emergency planners actively teach and depend on, distilled into a phrase repeated in every coastal town briefing. If it's long or it's strong, get gone. Do not wait for a warning. Do not wait for a phone alert. If the ground shakes for a long time or shakes hard, treat that as the warning itself and move to higher ground immediately. On this night, that culture of preparedness, built over years of drills and painful historical lessons, became the reason there were no reported injuries and no confirmed serious damage, even as an official tsunami warning sat live over an entire stretch of coastline. The warning did not last long, at least not in absolute terms, though it likely felt considerably longer to the people living through it. 14 minutes after the initial alert went out, at 9:52, the mobile alert itself was canceled. But the caution did not end there. At 10:37, the agency issued a broader national advisory covering the beach and marine areas between Milford Sound and Poiseugur Point, warning specifically of strong and unpredictable currents. The kind of hazard that does not necessarily produce a wall of water crashing onto a beach, but can still drag a boat off its mooring, sweep a person off rocks, or create dangerous surges in harbors and river mouths for hours after the main shaking has stopped. That advisory held until 11:41, when officials confirmed no tsunami had been detected and formally declared that the threat had passed. By the time the last cancellation notice went out, close to 2 hours had elapsed since the ground first moved. 2 hours in which an entire regional coastline operated under active evacuation orders, in which emergency coordination centers ran through protocols built for exactly this scenario, in which a nation that has spent years anticipating a much larger version of this exact night watched to see whether tonight was finally that night. It was not. But the machinery that responded to it, the alert systems, the evacuation instincts, the layered advisories that scaled down carefully rather than being switched off all at once, all of it performed precisely as designed. And in the aftermath, officials and independent seismologists alike pointed to that performance as something close to a best-case demonstration of how a smaller regional event should be handled. The scale of public response gives some sense of just how widely this tremor was felt, even in a country accustomed to regular seismic activity. Within hours, New Zealand's Geological Monitoring Agency had logged tens of thousands of individual felt reports, submitted by ordinary people describing exactly what they experienced, where they were standing, what shook, what fell. This kind of citizen reporting is not incidental data collection. It forms a real-time intensity map that helps scientists understand how energy from the rupture actually traveled through different types of ground, which communities experienced genuinely dangerous shaking, and which simply felt a long, rolling sway that was unsettling but not destructive. Even communities more than 1,000 kilometers from the epicenter, well up into the North Island, reported feeling something, a testament to how efficiently seismic energy from a deep offshore rupture can travel through the particular geology of this part of the world. For a region defined by its remoteness, the earthquake also became something of an unplanned experiment in disaster response under close to ideal conditions. The epicenter sat in unpopulated wilderness. Fiordland's dominant human presence in that specific stretch of coastline is tourism infrastructure, boat operators, small settlements, seasonal workers, rather than dense residential development. This meant that a tremor large enough to trigger a genuine tsunami warning, large enough to be felt across most of the South Island and beyond, produced no confirmed injuries and no significant structural damage. It is worth sitting with that outcome for a moment, not because it diminishes the seriousness of the event, but because it illustrates something important about risk in this part of the world. The danger in Fiordland has never primarily been about population density. It has been about proximity to some of the most seismically loaded geology on the planet, geology that happens, for now, to sit mostly beneath forest and fjord rather than city blocks. That framing shifts considerably the moment attention turns north and east toward the fault this tremor sits beside but did not rupture. Because while the Pusagur subduction zone produces a steady, almost routine background hum of seismic activity, seismologists recording somewhere in the range of 100 or more earthquakes above magnitude 5 in this general region over the past 2 decades alone, the Alpine Fault operates on an entirely different timescale and with an entirely different character. It does not creep. It does not slowly release its accumulated strain through frequent small tremors the way some fault systems do elsewhere in the world. Scientific drilling projects conducted directly into the fault itself. Boreholes sunk deep into the rock near the small settlement of Wataroa, north of the Franz Josef Glacier, have confirmed what surface geology long suggested. The Alpine Fault is locked. The two sides are essentially welded together at depth, unable to slip gradually, which means the strain does not dissipate quietly over time. It simply accumulates, year after year, decade after decade, until the rock can no longer hold, and it lets go all at once. The Deep Fault drilling project at Wataroa is worth pausing on, because it represents one of the more remarkable scientific undertakings anywhere in the world. An international team of researchers essentially reaching down into the throat of an earthquake that has not happened yet. Engineers sank a borehole barely 4 inches wide, more than a kilometer into the crust, threading it directly across the fault plane itself, extracting rock, measuring temperature gradients, sampling fluids trapped in the crushed stone that marks the boundary between the plates. What they found only reinforced the urgency of the surrounding research. The fault zone runs unusually hot, heated by friction and by fluids forced upward under pressure, conditions that actually help explain why this particular fault behaves the way it does, rupturing in sudden, complete, catastrophic slips, rather than the slower, creeping release seen on some other plate boundaries around the world. Every sample pulled from that borehole becomes another data point in models attempting to answer the one question nobody can yet answer with precision. Not whether the fault will break. Every scientist involved agrees that it will. But how much warning, if any, the rupture might give before it does. When that release finally comes, the numbers involved are staggering even by the standards of a country that has already endured devastating seismic events in living memory. Based on the fault's past rupture behavior, land on either side is expected to shift horizontally by as much as 8 meters and vertically by several meters more in a matter of seconds, along a rupture length stretching for hundreds of kilometers simultaneously. This is not a localized event confined to one town or valley. Modeling exercises conducted by New Zealand's geological agencies envision a rupture severing road and rail links across the width of the South Island, isolating entire regions for weeks, cutting off hydroelectric infrastructure that a significant portion of the country depends on for power, and generating shaking intensities across a broad swath of the island, severe enough to cause widespread structural damage, landslides in the steep, saturated terrain of the Southern Alps, and disruption on a scale New Zealand has planned for specifically because it has never actually experienced anything quite like it in the modern era. The closest comparison available in living memory is smaller in every respect, and it is still remembered as one of the defining tragedies in the country's modern history. The Canterbury earthquake sequence, culminating in a magnitude 6.3 rupture centered almost directly beneath Christchurch, claimed around 180 lives, the overwhelming majority lost in the sudden collapse of just 2 large buildings, and left a scar across the city's infrastructure and psyche that persisted for years afterward, in the form of rebuilding projects, demolished neighborhoods, and a generation of residents who now listen differently to any sound the ground makes. That event registered at magnitude 6.3. The rupture scientists are tracking on the Alpine Fault, the one given a 3 in 4 chance of occurring within the coming decades, is expected to be roughly 100 times more powerful in terms of energy release, magnitude 8 or larger, distributed along a fault line many times the length of the one that broke beneath Christchurch. This is the context that transforms a moderate offshore tremor near a remote lakeside town into international news within hours. Not because the earthquake itself was uniquely destructive, by the numbers it plainly was not, but because it struck in the shadow of a much larger, much more certain reckoning that every seismologist working in this part of the world knows is coming, even if none of them can say precisely when. Scientists were quick and consistent in their public statements following this event. This specific rupture, occurring on the Puisagur interface rather than the Alpine Fault directly, is not believed to have meaningfully advanced the timeline on the larger fault, nor is it interpreted as a direct precursor signal in any scientifically established sense. And yet the geographic and structural relationship between the two systems, part of one continuous plate boundary running the length of the South Island, means that every tremor in this region inevitably gets read, at least partly, through the lens of the fault next door. In the days after the shaking stopped, some of the most striking commentary came not from seismologists, but from those tasked with understanding how communities actually experience an event like this, in real time, without the luxury of scientific detachment. Researchers working in hazard and risk, several with direct ties to the IWE and communities of the region, spoke about the human weight of an evacuation order issued on a freezing winter night, families woken from sleep, uncertain how serious the threat truly was, forced to make split-second decisions with incomplete information and very little time. That perspective matters as much as any seismic reading, because it is a reminder that behind every magnitude number and every probability percentage sits an actual population of people who have to live, day after day, ordinary year after ordinary year, in the shadow of a fault line that could, without warning, redraw the map beneath their homes. Officials who reviewed the response afterward were careful to frame it not as a false alarm to be dismissed, but as a successful rehearsal, evidence that the systems built over years of investment and public education function exactly as intended when they are finally tested for real. There is also something quietly instructive in how ordinary people responded to a night like this, something that speaks to a broader truth about living in a country built directly on top of an active plate boundary. New Zealanders in the affected region did not wait for permission to act. They recognized the length and strength of the shaking as its own warning system, moved to higher ground without needing an official alert to tell them what their own bodies had already registered, and in doing so, quite possibly prevented what could otherwise have been a very different outcome. Officials studying the response afterward described this instinct, deeply embedded through years of public education and repeated drilling, as one of the most important protective factors in the entire event. It is a sobering thought. In a region where a fault capable of magnitude 8 shaking sites locked and loading beneath the mountains, the single most reliable early warning system available to anyone standing on that coastline is not a satellite, not an app, not a government alert sent from a control room somewhere in Wellington. It is the ground itself, and whether the people standing on it have been taught to listen. As the immediate emergency response wound down that night, cancellation notices going out one after another, aftershocks continuing to ripple through the region in diminishing strength over the following days, The larger question the earthquake raised did not resolve nearly as cleanly. Scientists continued monitoring the sequence closely in the days that followed, watching for any subtle signal that stress had migrated toward the alpine fault itself, while publicly maintaining that current evidence did not support any change in the fault's underlying risk assessment. Emergency management officials, for their part, used the event as a live case study, a rare opportunity to test alert systems, evacuation behavior, and interagency coordination under genuinely urgent, if ultimately non-catastrophic, conditions, gathering lessons that will almost certainly be folded into planning for whatever comes next. And that is where this particular story has to end, not with resolution, but with the same unresolved tension that has defined this stretch of coastline for centuries. A tremor struck, reported first at magnitude 5.9, later confirmed larger, deep beneath one of the wildest and most beautiful landscapes on Earth. It triggered a tsunami warning that was handled, by every available account, about as well as such a warning can be handled, without loss of life, without serious damage, in a region so remote that entire river valleys carry the tremor and pass it along to no one at all. It reminded an entire nation, once again, that it is built directly across the seam where two of the planet's great tectonic plates are still very much in motion, still very much unfinished with each other. And it left, sitting exactly where it has sat for more than 300 years, a locked and loading fault line running the length of the South Island, carrying inside it a 3 in 4 chance of doing sometime in the coming decades something this small mountain tremor only hinted at. Somewhere beneath those mountains, the clock is still running. Nobody, not the scientists with their boreholes and their instruments, not the emergency planners with their sirens and their evacuation routes, can say with any certainty how much time is left on it. All any of them can do is keep watching, keep listening, and hope that when the ground finally does what it has always eventually done, the people standing on it are ready to move the moment it starts. What makes this particular corner of the world so difficult to look away from is not simply the scale of what is being predicted, but the strange, patient confidence with which it is being predicted. This is not a warning based on fear or speculation. It is a warning built on 8,000 years of physical evidence, on rock samples pulled from a kilometer underground, on GPS stations that have spent decades quietly recording the two sides of the South Island, creeping past each other by a few centimeters a year, evidence that never stops accumulating even on the calmest, quietest days when nothing at all seems to be happening at the surface. Every year that passes without a rupture is not a year of safety. It is another year of loading, another increment added to a debt that geology always eventually collects. And so, the tremor near Teanau becomes something more than a single news cycle, more than a magnitude number revised upward in the hours after impact. It becomes a kind of annual reminder, one of several such reminders that arrive every few years along this coastline, that the ground beneath one of the most spectacular landscapes on Earth is not simply scenery. It is an active, unfinished geological process, one still very much underway, one that has been shaping these mountains for millions of years and shows no sign of considering its work complete. Fiordland's forests, its glaciers, its deep black fjords carved by ice and time, all of it sits directly on top of a boundary between two continents, still very much in the process of arguing over where exactly one ends and the other begins. For now, the aftershocks have faded, the tsunami advisories have long since been cancelled, and life along that remote southern coastline has returned to whatever counts as ordinary in a place built this close to the edge of the Earth's shifting plates. Boats have gone back out. Tourists have returned to Milford Sound to watch waterfalls fall thousands of feet down sheer granite walls, unaware, most of them, that they are standing almost directly above one end of a fault line capable of producing an earthquake, unlike anything New Zealand has recorded in its modern history. The scientists continue their work quietly in the background, adding each new tremor to a data set that grows a little larger and a little more precise with every passing year. And the fault itself, the real subject of this story, the one that did not rupture on this particular winter night, remains exactly where it has always been, locked beneath the mountains, patient, silent, and according to every measurement available, closer than it has ever been to letting go.